Go for it.
Okay, we are back with Alan Martinez, who's the Senior Manager for Strategic Partnerships at Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, where he focuses on building and managing partnerships that connect the expertise and research capacity at Cornell with sustainability partners in nonprofit, government, and private sector organizations. He's going to talk today to us about financing regenerative agriculture in the Great Lakes region. So I will hand it over to him now. And just before I do that, though, just a reminder that the CECA credits will be, the QR code will be posted at the end of today. So if you do have to jump off, feel free to email me and request a QR code. With that, take it over, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. It's great to see you. Wish it was also in person because there's a lot of black boxes on my screen. So feel free to join us here, and feel free to interject. I would really like this as always in our work at the center. Our work is about partnerships, building connections, and so it's wonderful to be in front of all of you, given the work that you're doing. So my name is Alan Martinez. I do work in the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. It is the sustainability research hub at Cornell. It tries to identify and bring together research across the entire sustainability spectrum. But of course, a lot of it is engaged in this world of agriculture. But we also cover energy and water and you name it. I think we're certainly doing it at Cornell, and we try to move that forward, move research into action. So it's great to hear, as we just did from Bethany, some of the connections with universities and researchers. My background is also on your side of the camera here. My background is in the practitioner side. I spent 20 years in finance and sustainable finance, working internationally and in the US, trying to figure out how do we use finance for good. And I think that is what I'm bringing to this work. It's what the center saw as an opportunity for us to move research to action. We need to understand how people can use these things. And so I'm very lucky to be working in this world. So today I'm going to talk to you about a project that I've been running for the last 3 years together with a faculty member here named John Tobin. He works in the Dyson School. And his work on just understanding the gap in financing conservation is what kind of gave fuel and momentum to this activity. But I will say this, the main thing that got us going was this challenge, which I don't think is new to any of you. It's the algae bloom challenge across all waterways these days, it seems, but certainly in our case, taking a look at the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes Protection Fund came to us 3 years ago now and said, can you have a look at what could regenerative agriculture do to support the health of the Great Lakes region or the Great Lakes watershed? And in that spirit, we said, well, yes, we could, but there are probably better people to do it. The thing that we can do is understand the role of finance, the role of the financial sector, the private sector, in contributing and supporting regenerative agriculture to do this work. I will admit today that was very naive. How might innovative financial solutions help accelerate the adoption of regenerative agriculture in the Great Lakes region is kind of the big challenge that we're trying to deal with. But fast forward and talking to so many of you on the call, but also others, the first thing we realized was that nobody really knew 3 years ago what regenerative agriculture is. Some people would say we still don't know, but we did gravitate towards these principles, these big principles, all of which I think are probably very familiar to all of you, even if you might not use the label of regenerative agriculture. And I think amongst the farmers that we've interviewed and that we've worked with, very few of them actually use this label. And yet these principles really resonate. They resonate for a lot of for all of the work that you've done over the years to support conservation and conservation farming. haven't gotten our heads around like what is regenerative agriculture. This is all we knew about it 3 years ago. I did want to share with you that, last week, maybe a month ago, um, similar groups of people like General Mills and Cargill, PepsiCo, and so many other large multinationals that are supporting regenerative agriculture have accepted that, yes, the definitions are too loose and we need to tighten this up. And this is where it's going today. It's trying to really hammer, get clarity on what are the soil health elements, what are the water, what are the biodiversity, what are the climate elements, what are the outcomes we seek, how would we measure those outcomes, and then most importantly, what are the practices? What are the practices that would help us to achieve these goals? Working from a global perspective down to a local, or also working from the local perspective and thinking about how that can influence global sustainability goals. The other thing I think is important is that this work did not begin as a carbon challenge or the climate challenge. It's really started with water. And over the years, I think we've seen that, oh yeah, it is about all of these things working together and kind of building on each other. And most importantly, in my work, is just trying to understand, well, what will bring partners to the table? So in that spirit, especially because at the center of all of this is farmers, we knew that soil health was the thing, the hook, the reason for most farmers to engage in this topic. It's not the only reason, but it's the major reason. And certainly in New York State, where we've done about more than 100 deep dive interviews with farmers, we recognize that this is what brings them to the conversation. We're very encouraged by the pioneering work that you're doing, that farmers are doing, to think about the climate challenges, as have been mentioned today, but also the biodiversity and nature challenges, the water quality issues. And we don't hear as much about it, but there is a very important element of the social and economic impact of farming and on farming communities, and how regenerative agriculture can support those goals as well. The second question that we kind of had to figure out was not only what is regenerative agriculture, but how do we, from a financial perspective, how do we support regenerative agriculture? What could we create to make that happen? I think if you look closely in this photo, you'll see faces that are familiar to you. Because what we did over the last few years is we've tried to talk to and bring together small groups and large groups of individuals who can really inform how this would relate to New York State, the Great Lakes watershed in New York State, as kind of the prototype or the incubation, the piloting effort that we might do here. But the question became, well, what would we do? And I think you can appreciate that a lot of times Cornell and researchers come to the sector and say, this is what we should do. Coming from a practitioner and a private sector background, I really wanted to figure out, well, what would you do? I'm not a farmer. I'm not an agriculture expert. I really wanted to hear from the farming community about what they needed and wanted in order to move regenerative agriculture forward. So we looked at a number of different models. All of these models, all of these different mechanisms, we'll call them, are working in some part of the world, and certainly in the United States. Pay for success models, crop insurance, equipment financing, carbon markets, transition loan products through farm credit and others, sustainability linked bonds, all kinds of really fun, clever, great ideas that are working in some parts of the country. What we wanted to know, well, what would work here? And so we put these concepts and solutions in front of the farming community, and we asked them to vote. And after that vote, we said, we'll go find some folks who really know how to do this, and we'll work with them to design something that's relevant and contextually useful here in New York State. As you can see, we chose the Pay for Success model. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the pilot that we're running on Pay for Success. We weren't limited just to those working groups and those convenings. We also went to the farms. And we saw that there was an interest across all of New York State in regenerative agriculture and the pay for outcomes model. And we've been drilling down and really talking to and working, and this summer enrolling farmers in a pilot on how do you pay farmers for sustainable outcomes. We launched the New York Outcomes Fund earlier this year in January at the Corn and Soybean Growers Association meeting. This summer, we started to enroll farmers. In practice implementation started earlier this fall, and we're doing verification of those practices on tomorrow, actually. Tomorrow, so we're visiting about 113 fields in the next few days. Should be a lot of fun, and I think very familiar to you. One of the great things about this work is, as I said, we started with farmers. We started with what if we have some funding from the Great Lakes Protection Fund, and we've got a concept in mind, we have to start with what do farmers need? That was kind of the first step. We were really working iteratively as we developed this concept. The second thing we realized pretty quickly was, well, it's nice to have philanthropic dollars. It's always wonderful to have government dollars if we can get them, but we need a buyer on the other side if we're going to encourage farmers to produce sustainable outcomes. And we were very fortunate to find a buyer who was interested in buying sustainable outcomes, especially carbon and water quality outcomes in this pilot. The next two things that has kind of been mentioned already by Bethany earlier today was, first, how do you engage farmers? And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we reach farmers? How do we talk to farmers about these things that, maybe they've heard of, but there's a lot of confusion in the market about outcomes-based payments or carbon payments. And so the first thing was just the marketing, the outreach. The second thing was getting money in the hands of farmers to begin to adopt these practices. And so we pay farmers up front to engage on this topic and to adopt these practices. We also provide technical assistance. We've leaned more towards some of the simpler, easier to implement practices that so many of you have already been encouraging farmers to do. We're just asking them to scale those practices, so that minimizes how much TA is needed. But still, we have agronomic support through Cornell Cooperative Extension and others to support farmers. On the other side of this circle is the other really important thing that not only farmers but also our buyer is really interested in. Is it verifiable? Is it measurable? How are you going to report it? What's the verification process? And so happy to talk about those details, but in short, there's a lot of work to do here, and we're in a pilot phase. I'm sure we're doing some things really well. I'm sure we're still learning how to get things to be better. So today we have a partnership with the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. It's a technology company running out of Iowa. It's trying to do this in Iowa and within the Corn Belt. We're partnering with the New York Corn and Soybean Growers Association to help us reach producers. And Cargill has supported us by being the pre-purchase agreement, agreeing upfront that if we can generate these outcomes for the climate, for water, for biodiversity, they would buy them. And so now the challenge is up to us. How do we help? How do we work with partners and farmers to create these outcomes? And there are challenges, right? So for us, I think one of the really important things is, if you go back to that chart that I showed you earlier, we figured out one thing we can do that is very interesting and important and useful. It's a platform that we're really encouraged by. That doesn't mean we've solved everything. Capital is still a problem for farmers. Knowledge about these practices is a challenge. The timing, which in many cases you can't control because we can't control the weather. Agronomic conditions, the economic conditions, equipment, the availability of equipment, the availability of labor. These are all the big buckets of things that will still challenge regenerative agriculture, even if our program is successful. Can we put some effort and improve these things? Absolutely. And so we're working on the capital question, we're working on the knowledge and the timing questions. But there are always going to be challenges in this kind of work. What I'm encouraged by as a researcher is that there's also always opportunities to collaborate, to do research. And even as we kind of complete the pilot, so we'll complete the pilot, we'll close enrollment here in the next few weeks. Our initial goal is to enroll 1,000 acres in the pilot. Through Cargill's pre-purchase agreement, we were able to move to 10,000 acres. If we're very lucky here in the next few weeks, we will hit our 10,000 acre goal and enroll more than 20 farmers in this program as a pilot. At the same time, our goal was not to just do something that is what I would call regenerative agriculture part one. There is still more to do in regenerative agriculture, and here's a few of the things. Number one, and I'd love to collaborate with Amy and all of you on these issues. One, how do we maintain or enhance biodiversity in the Great Lakes region? We talk a lot in Regen Ag about the first things, the soil, the carbon sequestration, or even water quality. We don't really put a lot of rigor around the question of biodiversity. How are we actually using and supporting biodiversity? So we're looking into that question next. The next thing here is, how do we connect? This is great. We're creating markets, creating commodities, but how are we connecting that to the supply chain, to products, to real consumer goods, right? That's the second thing. The next thing is, we're completing this pilot year. We're going to have a lot of interesting data. We're hopeful that this can be useful in the modeling of carbon and nature outcomes. We're hopeful that we can pair this with data, for example, with the Lab of Ornithology and their work with eBird. And we're looking, and then lastly, we're going back to that chart before. We're looking at what are the other innovations, financial innovations. Equipment finance is a big one. And so we're looking at, can we engage leasing companies or insurance companies or other financial companies to support the farmers that are really scaling regenerative agriculture in New York? For me, it's exciting. I can talk about this almost all the time, but I think that we're trying to get in the minds of people that yes, there are ways to increase the number of acres that are under conservation and can produce conservation outcomes. There is a way for us to engage farmers, and I'm happy to go into more details here. On average, I think our farmers are about 12 to 1,500 acre farmers. We have much smaller farmers at 250 acre size. We have farmers that are at the 6,000 acre size. But we know that this is a great starting point for a regenerative agriculture journey. And we see that there's important ways for us to support farm viability and drive some of the important research that still needs to be done. We're really good at that, but only through partnerships with organizations like yours and your separate organizations can we really get to all of the outcomes and goals that we have on the screen. Let's see. Erin, I'd love to make this a conversation and just open it up to questions. I don't know if happy to go back to slides if it's helpful, but please let me know where we can engage.
Sure. Yeah, so there are a few comments or questions. So basically one question here from Tim. What is impact investing and nutrient trading? And I'm sorry, I should have said this before. Yeah. So Alan can answer that, but then let's open it up. We earlier today we definitely had some just open interaction, and I thought that was interesting. So let's open it up and talk about it. So but do you have an answer for Tim there? Or?
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. So just jumping back to this. So impact investing, there are some wonderful investors, largely individual, but also in some cases foundations and other and even larger institutional investors that are creating funds specifically to support the purchase of land and the conversion of land to regenerative practices with the unique mechanism of figuring out how do you then help landowners take over, and how do you help those farmers then buy the land. And so one that was featured in our conversations is an organization named Dirt Capital. I encourage you to have a look at what they're doing. They're doing some really interesting work on impact investing and regenerative agriculture. On the other question of nutrient trading, Vermont has a wonderful way of thinking about nutrient. I won't go into the specifics. I know we had a team member from, or an advisor from the Vermont conservation world who encouraged us to really look into that. I think one of our researchers did that research and presented some of that work, but it's along the lines of some of the carbon credits or nutrient credits. I think in that case it was nitrogen, but I have to check my notes. And some of you may have that knowledge as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, and Tim, please ask your question so I can get into the nuances of it too. I see you've also responded here on Cargill's motivation.
Yeah, can you expound on that at all?
Yeah, to some degree. I think there is a group of corporations and organizations serving the agriculture supply chain globally. Cargill is one of them. And they have, for many reasons, in some cases, publicly traded companies have been getting a lot of pressure to make sustainability commitments. And as I think all of you know, they have not been able to. And so we end up with this thing called greenwashing. Making commitments, but not living up to them. And I think that's one of the motivations for the sector, the agriculture sector, that is getting either pressure from their own shareholders, or just pressure, in some cases, pressure from inside the organization, the people who care about sustainability at Cargill, pushing up. In Cargill's case, Cargill is a privately held company, and so it's majority owned by the family. And I think that in Cargill's case, which has made a 10 million acre commitment to support the conversion of or the adoption of regenerative agriculture across that much acreage, I think there's a number of motivations, and I would say that this is true across the sector. First, we're seeing, if we start to think about not next year or the next 3 to 5 years, if we start to look forward 50 years ahead, right now the Gen Z generation is just moving into our world, just beginning to really move into our workforces, and the level and commitment to sustainability that we're seeing demographically is growing tremendously. The interest in where food comes from, how healthy it is, how regenerative it is just tremendous. That hasn't turned into consumer demand, but there is that demand. I think if you look forward, regenerative practices just makes a lot of sense. Of course, the climate and the pressure and the threat of climate change is a big one. Farmers are transitioning, and so I think that there's both the fact that some of in our case with our partners, there's partners that really are seeing the impact on their own supply chains, and want to strengthen and make that supply chain more resilient, and moving to regenerative practice makes the supply chain more resilient. It allows you to stay in business, and so I think I've hit on and hinted on a couple of those. Happy to explore those further too.
Oh, no, that's good. Good explanation.
Thanks.
Really interesting project.
Okay. I'll scan Aaron from I'm surprised money was not a top outcome. We are, when we started this project, started enrolling farmers. We were, if you look at all of the climate or carbon programs out there, and again, it's hard to compare because we're not a purely carbon program. we're paying farmers more than any other program out there in the United States. Now, is that sustainable for the entirety of their transition to regenerative? Hard to say. It'd be great to get some, to get some funding to help us scale or to help sustain this work. It's a pilot, so we're trying to see what is the financial benefit for farmers in terms of yield, impact on yield. We're also looking at, well, what is the price point that would make it sensible for farmers to make these transitions? There's a lot of questions around just that price point and the financial or the money outcome that is that's the point of the pilot, is to try to figure out what is the price point that makes the most sense? How do we get not 5% or 10%, but really a majority of farmers adopting these practices? And how do we partner with the folks that you've heard from today to be part of that effort? So still, I would leave it as a question. Still out there. From Mary. Do those offering the technical assistance to producers include soil and water districts and SNRCS, or is it a separate partners from university or private industry? So in this case, in the pilot phase, we focused on getting the components of the product or the pilot sorted out and just trying to think about, well, what are the big things that we need to figure out in order for this to work? The first thing is, do we have something that farmers value? Is there value to farmers? No point doing anything else if that's not happening. Secondly, is there a financial sustainable opportunity here? And so getting that private sector funder was kind of another key linchpin. The third point was verification, and so that kind of comes to your your comment here: verification and technical assistance. And in our case, we are working with Cornell Cooperative Extension to conduct some of those field visits, some of that technical assistance, some of the data gathering requests, but of course, we've had a number of conversations with the Soil and Water Conservation Districts, the New York chapter, but also at the national level, just trying to understand what would be the connection if we went to scale. So at this level, you need not even a half-time team member to do this. But if we went to scale, if we went from not 20 farmers, but 200 farmers, would that be a point where you really want to figure out how do you leverage the existing conservation district network or consulting network or the other networks that already exist, rather than having to build it up? And so I think the question is still out there, Mary, and if there's ways for us to make that happen, absolutely, let's sort it out. I'd love to, in this case, because we're looking at the Great Lakes region and the watershed and the impact on the watershed, we'd love to see how can we work with NRCS on a regional conservation partnership that really helps, that leans into this, but also figures out all of the different, and that's why I'm so excited to be here, because there are so many people working in conservation, and we just can't get in front of them like this on a regular basis. So if anyone's interested in working with us on this and helping us think about not just the pilot, happy to engage on the pilot and the review of the pilot, but I'd love to talk to folks about how do we scale this? How do we go beyond this? We have the private sector ready to engage. We need to see how can we get the nonprofit and public sector to kind of match. And when I say we have them ready, we have partners like Cargill ready to engage, we have money on the table to match. And so I think that's what so all those things that I described earlier, and I should just jump to it, because if I leave you with anything, it's like, how would you answer these questions? These are the things that I'd love to connect with people on moving forward.
All right. So,
Aaron, curious to hear your thoughts too, as maybe one of the earliest conversations I had in this.
yeah. Oh, well, it looks like I was saved by Scott. So I'll come
Scott,
back to me. Go ahead, Scott.
thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, guys. My audio is a little choppy. Hopefully, I'm coming through a little clear what I'm hearing. But thanks for the presentation, Alan, and last comments that you just made. Looking for partnerships. Should strike a chord with those on the line, especially I think district and ag conservation business for for all the while now, 80 plus years, I guess. And I wonder, what do you see the future entailing, more than cover crops, or do you think they might, these private sector companies might be interested in lifting the cost share burden for publicly funded projects on other things like structural practices, the kinds of things that populate the award lists of Agnon points, and CRF, and EQIP, and the like? How can we foster that kind of relationship where, a lot of times in our end, we hear a common refrain is, well, if we can't leverage 100 cost share, we might not be able to do these projects. Trying to get the federal and state bureaucracies to link up in that way is doable, but often really challenging, and things beyond anybody's control. But perhaps if there is, as you say, money on the table by the private sector, that usually, in my mind at least, opens up the door for flexibility and path to get to 100% cost share, or at least leaving the farmer of a lot of the financial burden for practices that not that perhaps we want to see more done more than they do. And flares come to mind, but perhaps there are others. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. I'll jump back to this slide because I think if we're looking at the sustainability commitments that the corporate sector has made on climate and biodiversity, water, soil health, these are the things that they're really wanting to see in their sustainability departments or in their sustainability reports. And this is what it requires of farmers to think about on this other side. And so riparian buffers and just a number of things that, as you say, it may not be available. And so I think that one of the, or possible without a 100% match. I think that there's probably a number of, it's obviously, it's a complicated question. We've been, so in this work, and I think as we get closer to, let's say, March and April next year, we hope to share our thinking around biodiversity, and especially looking at some of the additional, so that the comments by Bethany on agroforestry, for example. Can agroforestry be one of these practices that supports biodiversity and climate, but also that creates an opportunity for funding, so that will corporates pay for some of that funding or match some of that funding for biodiversity efforts and outcomes. The methane emission question. So we're talking about corn and soy, and we know that New York it's a dairy state, and so I think a lot of that corn and soy goes to dairies, and so I think that we're really interested in exploring, is there a similar concept like this outcomes fund concept that we can apply in the dairy sector on methane emissions? Can we look at that market for methane emission reductions? Lots of things to explore there, Scott. And I'm shortchanging your question with a poorly formed answer, but I think that I'd love to explore it for sure. That's definitely the important takeaway. Amanda?
Thank you, Alan.
Yeah. I think with Amanda, the question is avoided conversion, paying farms to maintain permanent cover, not just some cover for part of the year. Yes, the short answer is yes. again, I will remind you, I'm not an agronomist, and I'm not a farmer, and so I think the details of how we do that are something that definitely we should look at as a practice. Some of and this is why it's so wonderful to have a partnership, right? Because if as many great ideas as I might have, I think that I love to ground truth them with the farming community and with the farmers that are part of the. We have a small group of advisors that includes 3 of the farmers, and these are questions that I would put there to find where are the priority or where are the opportunities that are most available. And yes, right now it's cover crops, but it's also crop rotations that we haven't seen. The diversity of crop rotation in New York State compared to Iowa is phenomenal. I think there's like maybe 20 different crops that we've seen in the drop down menu of what rotations are farmers using. There's maybe 5 in Iowa, and so it gives you a sense of, yeah, we can't just take what we're seeing somewhere else and do it here. We're still learning a lot. But I think that that's one. I don't know if that answers your question, Amanda. Please feel free to share more about your thinking on this question.
I think it'd be great to have a conversation at some point about that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so we still. Well, go ahead, Alan.
No, I was just going to say that at the beginning of this presentation, I shared my email address. So I'm happy to talk to any of you on this. I am based in Ithaca, so please feel free to reach out. And Aaron.
Yeah, so thanks. I can't help but make this about me, but so you asked about my opinion, so I'll just say that American Farmland Trust is got a climate smart commodities grant to work with Truterra, and we do have several farms in New York that we'll be working with, and several of them will be in the Great Lakes. So it is to look at payment for ecosystem services, and I unfortunately don't have a lot of detail beyond that, but I would certainly want to work together where we can and make something work and not duplicate efforts, because again, we all have the same goals of just trying to get conservation on the ground. And then one concern that I have is just, well, one is a lot of these programs don't pay for conservation that's already been there, or farms that have been doing the practices. And I can understand why an investor would, a funder would want to pay for new things. But I do think that that's a sore spot with programs. And then I also get concerned that farmers will kind of hold back and wait because, I might be able to get a payment if I hold off. If I start doing something now, I won't get a payment. Or I won't be able to, I'll be ineligible to get a payment, 2 years from now when this is no longer a pilot and is up and running. So I haven't heard anybody say that. So I can't say that that's likely, but I just, at some point there would be a tipping point where I'm not going to do these things on my own. I'm going to wait for a payment, and that's expensive. And especially if it's taxpayer money, it's like, I don't think we want that either, of just taxpayers paying for everything. That's just kind of a concern that I have. I don't know if you want to comment on that. You don't have to, but that's my.
I think they're great. It signals the depth of understanding of, and what we're starting to see is like this farmers are not all the same, right? I think all of you know that. There's this interesting segmentation that we're starting to see, and how we relate and connect and support the adoption to these practices is going to vary by farmer. And so the early adopter or the farmers that have been doing this the longest aren't as eligible, or can't find the number of acres to enroll in the program. That's real. but that's real for a very small fraction of farmers. I would say that of the 20 farmers we've talked to, maybe 10 of them said, I'm sure I don't qualify, but I'll talk to you. And so we were very encouraged to say, oh, you've been doing that, great. But if you did this, and if you did this, and so if it's not just, yeah, we've been doing cover crops on a field in the corner of the farm for some time. There are fields where they aren't doing cover crops, or they aren't doing the reduced tillage approaches, or they haven't done a new rotation. And so I think there are opportunities for almost all farmers. There are those champions in New York that, yes, they've done everything and more than we've even imagined. And so, yes, there's a challenge there, which is why we're also looking at those, set aside these payment for outcomes, and let's look at leasing equipment, and let's look at reduced transition loan programs, or let's look at other ways to support from a financial perspective how farmers can be successful. I think the other comment you made on holding off, like, will farmers hold off? I'll say this: we asked farmers, how many of you are participating in a carbon program in January? In a room of 100 farmers, only one raised their hand. And now I can tell you that there are now 20. So I think that it's not gonna, I don't think it's, I don't know, we'll see. We also don't have any more funding. We're now out of the acres. And surprise, and you all appreciate this too. And now farmers are calling us because they now have time. They're done with harvest now. And the weather's been bad, so now we're getting calls. But we've reached our limit, and so it's always an interesting question of supply and demand. Right now, we've reached our goal for the pilot, and we don't have any more funding. But I think what we'd like to do is talk to folks on this call and in your previous conversations, and in this broader community of, well, how do we get the funding for this? It's one of the biggest challenges. We're involved in a number of climate smart partnerships as well, just in terms of in other respects, and we know there's a lot of funding in this sector. It's just we were glad to be able to do a pilot just to show that this can be done if the funding comes forward. And so it's exciting to have it's exciting to have you work with Natera, was it? And others, because we need more innovation in this space. I think that's really valuable. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that in-depth answer. I will, yeah, I'll be reaching out to you at some point. So,
Anytime.
yeah. So any other thoughts, questions? Maybe, let's see, actually, is your screen still being shared? You might want to, put your email up there one last time, but, anyway.
I did have a question.
Go ahead,
Aaron.
Scott.
It's probably not a good question, maybe simple or a stupid question, but the Outcomes Fund, are you paying on verification of implementation, or are you paying on verification that carbon in the soil has gone up?
Good question, Scott. So we are mapping fields. We are verifying the practice that has been adopted, and we are running the data through models, USDA approved models, Comet Farm model, to determine to estimate how much carbon was sequestered. And depending on the percentage or the tons of carbon sequestered, that forms part of the payment. The other part of the payment is based on how much nitrogen or phosphorus pounds were reduced in the implementation phase. And so together, those payments, that makes up the payment. So not everybody is getting the same payment. It's based on the impact that we expect on those fields.
Thank you.
thank you for this opportunity, Aaron, Scott. Thank you for inviting me. I want to say one last thing, which is I am entirely, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a farmer. I'm not in the conservation world with the 30 years of experience that so many of you have. But I've been welcomed in such an amazing way by the farming community, by all of you. And so I encourage you to continue, welcoming outsiders into your world. It's really, really kind, and I think it moves our work forward in sustainability. Consider us a resource at the center. I don't just do this; I do all kinds of partnerships. Happy to explore anything and everything you might want to do to move your work forward. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Alan. Appreciate it.